we are continuing our discussion of Hobbes in this video. We first looked at Hobbes' argument about the state of nature, that it's a terrible thing, and that through the use of reason we can escape the state of nature by making covenants. Right? The three laws of nature, Hobbes tells us, are that we should seek peace, we should lay down our right to all things, and we should keep our covenants. Right? This time around, we're going to look at Hobbes's theory of the commonwealth and the importance of instituting and maintaining a commonwealth in this larger project of seeking peace. So here's the plan that I want to carry out for this video. I want to review some of the central ideas from last time. We'll talk about psychological egoism, the state of nature, and Hobbes's so-called laws of nature. We'll think about our duties to obey the government and the rights of the government to enforce the law on us. And last, we'll look at Hobbes's theory of monarchy. So in that way, we will extend our understanding of Hobbes a good deal. Now, let's recap where we've gotten so far with Hobbes. We learned last time that Hobbes is what they call a psychological egoist, right? He says that every time you voluntarily perform an act, you are doing what you believe to be advancing the good of yourself, right? So when we defend ourselves in the state of nature, that's one example of defending our personal good. But the entry into contracts and the making of covenants, that's also aimed at our personal good. Hobbes also tells us that when we imagine the state of nature, and that is a situation where there is no government and there are no laws, right? And in the state of nature, Hobbes sees this as more or less a terrible hellscape, right? Where your life is uncertain and you live in a state of continual fear. And he says a big part of why you live in a state of continual fear is because everything is legal. Nothing is just or unjust, right? And in that way, Hobbes is saying that everybody has a right to all things. You have the right to do whatever you want when there is no government and there are no enforcement mechanisms. But Hobbes isn't telling us that the state of nature is permanent or that human beings are terrible all the time, right? He says that reason, which we all have, shows us that we should lay down the right to all things. So we should give up our right to do whatever we want, because this is the best way of seeking peace, which of course will advance our personal good. Hobbes further tells us when he's advancing this theory, and this starts to get us towards his theory of the sovereign, it's that contracts and covenants are only valid when there is sufficient coercive force for both parties. Because it would make no sense for me to do my part in a covenant if I knew that you were going to simply cheat me in the process. So this leads us to a transition, right? If Hobbes is telling us that in order to have valid covenants that get us out of the state of nature, he's telling us that there needs to be sufficient coercive force, right? When we're talking about sufficient coercive force, we're talking about the idea of there being a system of threats, right? Disincentives against breaking your covenants. And Hobbes is going to tell us what it's going to take to create the kind of entity that's going to keep us all in line, that will make it not worth it for us to lie, cheat, and steal, right? So we can ask, how much power will it take to prevent us from descending back into the hell that is the state of nature? Building up, I assigned 13, 14, 15 as readings, and then this time around we're looking at 18, 19, but I do want to flag just a helpful passage from chapter 17 from Leviathan. And here's what Hobbes tells us there. He says, the final cause, end, or design of men. So this is our purpose, our aim, who naturally love liberty and dominion over others. So we like not being told what to do. We also like having power over others. But he says, our aim when we introduce restraint upon ourselves, in which we see them living in commonwealths, is the foresight of their own preservation. So even though we like to be free and even though we like to rule over others, we restrain ourselves, and we do it because we have foresight. We have the wisdom to know that we will be better off in the long run if we give up some freedom and dominion over others, because we live a more contented life thereby. And that is to say, we get ourselves out of that miserable condition of war, that is, the state of nature, which is necessarily consequent, as hath been shown, to the natural passions of men when there is no visible power to keep them in awe, right? Awe basically means a sort of fearful respect, right? So when there is no government, then the natural passions of man take the lead, and in those situations we descend into war, right? So we need something that keeps us in awe, and it ties them by fear of punishment to the performance of our covenants. So the idea is that we are seeking peace by instituting a commonwealth, right? And the commonwealth is a power that we all recognize that keeps us in awe and makes us fearful of the punishment that would emerge if we didn't keep our covenants. So this then leads us to the creation of a commonwealth. So what are we doing when we create this thing that keeps us in awe, that will enforce our covenants? Hobbes tells us this. He says, a commonwealth is said to be instituted when a multitude of men do agree and covenant, every one with every one, that to whatsoever man or assembly of men shall be given by the major part the right to present the person of them all, that is to say, to be their representative. And every one, as well he that voted for it as he that voted against it, shall authorize all the actions and judgments of that man or assembly of men in the same manner as if they were his own, to the end to live peacefully among themselves and to be protected against other men. Hobbes has a really interesting suggestion here that when we form a government, we say that the government has the right to present the person of them all. Another way of putting this is that when we create the state, we are creating an entity which will now be our representative, right? To present of me is to be my representative and to do my action and to be that which carries out certain parts of my will, which I would be carrying out perhaps myself in the state of nature. Right? But what we've done is we've laid down the right to all things, and now that we've given those things up, we are relying on our representative. You might recall that the artwork, the frontispiece, as it's called, for Hobbes's Leviathan, is a picture of a giant man, right? A king sort of looking down a valley at a town, right? And this individual with a sword and a scepter and a crown, he is made up of a bunch of little people. You see little individual people making up the body of this king, right? And the idea is that this is a creation of the individuals who are ruled by that particular sovereign, right? So we institute a commonwealth by creating a representative in the process of laying down our right to all things. And in this way, we say that what's happening when we create a state is we're creating that commonwealth by conferring sovereign power to that representative. And this representative is what Hobbes will call the Leviathan. Right? Now, he also points out that once you institute a new commonwealth through this covenant, you can't give away your right to all things to yet another representative, right? Because, for one thing, once you give away your right and transfer that right to someone else, you no longer have the entitlement at all. Like, you've already given it away, you can't give it to somebody else. But moreover, from a more practical and pragmatic perspective, Hobbes is going to point out to us that if we had multiple people claiming to be, the representative, to be constituting the Commonwealth, that would be a return to the state of nature and war. Now, last thing that's really interesting about this passage is that he says, look, you are subject to the rule by this new Commonwealth, even if your chosen representative was not selected, right? One thing that we might note in this passage is that, we have all made an agreement to have some representative for us, and we recognize that having any representative is better than having none at all and being back in the state of nature. So part of the selection process of a group might be this sort of agreement that we will pick somebody, and even if it isn't our first favored individual, we will still respect what the group has chosen. We can sort of see this line of thought as still part of what a good functioning democracy is. We respect the process, even if our favored candidate doesn't win. That's what's going to happen when a democracy is working at its best. But if you don't like the sovereign, Hobbes is also suggesting that you not only can't you transfer that right to somebody else after you've given away that right to another individual, but because the major part hath by consenting voices declared some entity to be the sovereign, he that dissented must now consent with the rest. That is, be contented to avow all the actions that the sovereign does, or else justly be destroyed by the group. For if he voluntarily entered into the congregation of them that were assembled, he sufficiently declared thereby his will, and therefore tacitly covenanted to stand to what the major part should ordain. Again, this is like respecting the democratic process, even if your winning individual, even if your favored candidate isn't the individual who wins, right? And therefore, if he refuse to stand thereto or make protestation against any of their decrees, he does contrary to his covenant, and therefore unjustly. So when we decide to pick a representative, part of your covenant is to go along with what the group decides. And whether he be of the congregation or not, and whether or not his consent be asked or not, he must either submit to the decrees or be left in the condition of war. So either you can join up or you can be cast off. And if you're cast off, then you're back in the state of nature. But if you're back in the state of nature, he points out, you might, without injustice, because everything is legal in the state of nature, be destroyed by any man whatsoever. Now, I suggested that Hobbes is maybe recognizing a certain sort of democratic instinct to respect the result of the process. That is, we wind up with the representative that the process selects, whether or not that's your first choice. That's democratic in a sense. But we might notice that there's also an anti-democratic thought right at the surface here. And the anti-democratic thought is you don't get to remove leaders just because you stopped liking them, right? When it comes to instituting a commonwealth, we are instituting an absolute ruler who will rule in perpetuity, right? And in this way, we can ask the question, what is the sovereign entitled to do, right? And here's an interesting point. It's a subtle point that I don't think every reader of Hobbes or every person talking about Hobbes recognizes for sure. And Hobbes is very clear that the sovereign's power is not granted by a covenant between the citizen and the sovereign. Now, it is true that there is a mutual covenant of all the citizens under the sovereign, and they are covenanting with one another, citizen to citizen, but there is no contract between the citizens and the sovereign. Hobbes is insistent about this, right? He says, in this way, you no longer have the right to all things as you once did before you made the covenant, but the sovereign still does. The sovereign is just the enforcer of the contracts that you have with other citizens who also laid down rights. So in this way, citizens do not have coercive power over the sovereign, even though the sovereign has it over you. Hobbes gives some interesting arguments about how, well, before a covenant of the people, they are not a single entity. So it's impossible for this future entity to make a covenant in the particular moment. But moreover, we couldn't have the sovereign making contracts, transfers of rights between themselves and every single citizen. So Hobbes is basically arguing in a somewhat complicated way that the logic of that doesn't work. But the other thing he points out is that if we have individual citizens claiming a covenant between themselves and the sovereign, then we would be in a situation where the sovereign could be accused of breach of covenant. But if we start to get into those sorts of disputes, Hobbes basically says we would therefore return to the sword again. We'd go out of the state of peace and back to the state of war. So it seems that Hobbes also has a practical thought in mind, which is just that we have to give somebody the final say in order to get us out of this situation of perpetual dispute. And once we develop this idea that while the citizens have laid down their right to all things, the sovereign has not, this is going to give the sovereign a great many rights. So, for instance, the sovereign has the right to determine which doctrines are averse. So this is more or less that the state, the king, for instance, should have the say about which official theological views should be taken on. And if you know your history a bit, and I don't know the entire history of the English Civil War, but it seems that Hobbes was mindful of the fact that one thing that was difficult for Charles I was maintaining peace in situations where reformers were trying to make counterclaims about official religious doctrine. Hobbes thought that we would have much less dispute and more peace and clarity if, as the leader of the Church of England, the king would have final say about which doctrines are good ones or averse doctrines. The sovereign has final say about the judicature, that is, about how courts are going to function. They create and enforce property law, so it is ultimately the sovereign who institutes the ways in which people have the right to protect certain goods. They have the right to declare war, nobody else. And the sovereign has the right to make appointments. That is, they get to ultimately choose their successor. If you don't have a choice of successor, then there's going to be squabbling as we go. He gets to determine rewards and punishments. And we might say that if there's something else that's going to be needed to produce and preserve peace under the sovereign, then the sovereign gets to do it. They have the final say, and their power, according to Hobbes, is unlimited. So, what Hobbes is telling us is that we need absolute rulers to protect us against going back to the state of nature where life is nasty, brutish, poor, and short. So after he develops this idea that the sovereign is instituted and given absolute power, we then ask what form of commonwealth is best. And Hobbes gives us a really nice way of giving typologies of commonwealths. He says that what type of commonwealth you're in depends on how many men constitute the sovereign. So it is true that in many cases, one individual will constitute the entity that we call the sovereign, but it could be that we have sort of an artificial individual that's created out of many individuals or even every individual. And Hobbes' thought here is that if the sovereign is constituted by one person, then we are living under a monarchy. If the sovereign is constituted by many individuals, that is, not one, more than one, but not everybody, then he's going to call it an aristocracy. And he'll further suggest that if everybody constitutes the sovereign, then it is what he calls a democracy, right? And in this way he says, the difference between these three kinds of commonwealth consists not in the difference of power, they all have the same amount of power, but in the difference of convenience or the aptitude to produce peace. Hobbes also tells us that this one, many, all categorization gives us all the kinds of commonwealth. He does suggest, for instance, that, well, if people don't like monarchy, then they call it a tyranny. If they don't like aristocracy, they call it oligarchy. And if they don't like democracy, they call it anarchy. But these aren't making new categories. These are just new names for the same thing. The three kinds of commonwealth for Hobbes are just monarchy, rule of the one, aristocracy, rule of the several, or democracy, rule of everyone. Right? And what he's going to say is that if we're trying to figure out what the best form of government is, his ultimate answer is going to be that there is a difference of convenience or aptitude to produce peace. And in this way, he's saying that any of these would be fine, but if we're thinking about what will most likely be most effective, he is ultimately going to argue that monarchy is the most convenient and apt approach for producing peace. And he gives us some reasons. He says, a monarch has a vested interest in the well-being of their subjects. So he's saying, when the citizens in a commonwealth are doing well, then the king will be doing well also, right? He says that this is more true in a monarchy than in an aristocracy. I guess we'd have to reflect a bit on exactly why we would see this more so in a monarchy or an aristocracy, but Hobbes does assert this. He also suggests that compared to an aristocracy and a democracy, a king can receive better counsel. Right? For instance, a king might be able to receive advice from experts in groups, and they might be able to receive advice from more people, and they might be able to ask more probing questions. Once we start doing this project as a group, there may be inefficiencies in getting good advice. He says that comparing an individual to a group, the individual will be more constant. The group will be inconstant, right? Inconstancy basically being inconsistency or changing in drastic ways about things like values from year to year. He also says that factions and internal envies and jealousies and petty disputes, you can find that between individuals, but you will not find that within an individual. So there are problems with groups that the monarch is less subject to. So that's his first line of thought. Now, Hobbes also does what a good philosopher will do, and he brings up a certain number of possible objections to his favorite approach. So one point is that monarchs are liable to whims and flattery. So the thought would be, if we have all of our power vested in one individual, maybe they might have their favorites. They might be tricked into favoring a policy by being flattered by some individuals, and they might make a bad decision on a whim. Maybe we protect against those things with a group. But Hobbes is going to tell us it might be true that monarchs have this problem, but he's actually going to say that whims and flattery are problems for groups as well. He says, for instance, that a persuasive, rhetorically powerful orator might be able to speak to a group and get them to make what we might think of as a whimsical, but maybe the better word would be impulsive and poorly thought out decision, right? And you can flatter a group just as you can flatter an individual. So Hobbes basically says this might be a problem for the monarch, but it's actually also a problem for the aristocracy and the democracy. There's another suggestion. Well, isn't it a problem that an infant might be appointed into the role of sovereignty through the right of inheritance? And this sort of thing actually did happen sometimes. So here's King Edward VI. He was coronated as the King of England in 1547 at the age of 9. And we might think, well, we don't want our country being led by a sovereign that is a 9-year-old. How's Hobbes going to respond to this one? Well, he points out, actually, again, the problem of a child monarch. He says that's actually a problem for all forms of government if it's a problem for monarchy. And Hobbes is a little bit funny on this one. He actually suggests that even though maybe you wouldn't literally have a citizenship that's entirely consisting of children in a democracy, nor would you have a child aristocracy running the country, here's what he says in section 9 of chapter 19. This is on page 122 of the edition I'm looking at. He says, on the other side, there is no great commonwealth, the sovereignty whereof in a great assembly, which is not as to consultations of peace and war and of making laws in the same condition as if the government were in a child. So on this point, Hobbes is telling us that if you look at how groups govern, sometimes groups govern like they are children. In fact, I'm recalling at this particular moment that in Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, he points out that groups are not necessarily more wise, and he cites Reinhold Niebuhr on this claim, saying that when you look at group behavior, there's actually more foolish folly and less wisdom in the group than in the individual. So even aristocracies and democracies can govern as if they are children. Plus, he might push back on this objection by saying a preceding monarch, the father of Edward VI, can ensure tuition of the child and also management of their decisions through a well-run team, right? And in this way, we might say that failure to care for the child is a failure of the monarch's subjects, that is, the people that the monarch hires. We might even say that an individual monarch could fail to get the right tutors for their children, but that's an objection to that way of securing tutors for your child, not monarchy in and of itself. So I'll leave it for you to reflect on this one. Is there something that can sometimes be preferable about a group? Are there cases where maybe groups are wiser than individuals? Maybe there is something to be said about governance by everybody rather than just the few or the one. And I'll leave it for you to reflect on what you would say back to Hobbes if you think that democracy is the best approach to governing. But I've gotten the main points that I'd like to discuss out. So just to recap some of these final points. The sovereign, Hobbes's Leviathan that is, has unlimited powers, which are necessary for keeping peace. Right? The sovereign's powers are granted by each citizen, who covenant to lay down their rights to all things to escape war. But remember, the sovereign themselves is not party to a covenant. The sovereign is just the enforcer of covenants. And the last thing we saw from Hobbes is his view is that monarchy, as opposed to aristocracy or democracy, is the best form of government, and maybe not as a matter of logic, but as a matter of tendency, right? And the tendency of monarchs to being the most apt and convenient approach to the preservation of peace. So we'll wrap up there. That is our look at why we need government and the nature of how we're going to institute it as told to us by Hobbes. Now we're going to jump ahead to contemporary times next week. So we'll take 2 sessions to look at an interesting book called The Problem of Political Authority by Mike Huemer. And this book will more or less argue the opposite of what Hobbes has said, whereas Hobbes argues for maximal government. Huemer is a libertarian, and he even calls his view an anarchist view, right? And on the anarchist view, limited government, or even perhaps no government, is what we should favor. So we will have a look at something completely different next week in the writings of Mike Huemer. So thanks for listening in. Take care. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out.